The wind had a voice that night, low and hollow, slipping through the cracks of an old wooden door. Each gust carried the scent of rain, dust, and something lonelier, the kind of silence that only wide Wyoming plains could hold. Out there, under a bruised sky, a single lantern swayed on the porch of the Grady Ranch. Its light trembled on the boards, and on the man standing still beside it. Thomas Grady hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks. War had taken his brothers. Fever had taken his wife. Now, only the wind kept him company, whispering through the prairie grass, humming through the hollow bones of his house. He didn't expect visitors, not in weather like this. Then came the sound. A wagon's creak, wheels dragging through the mud, hooves thudding slow, uncertain. And in that moment, Thomas felt something shift, the kind of stillness that comes before fate knocks on your door. He stepped out into the rain, hand resting on the rail, and saw the outline of a carriage through the storm. Inside it, two small shapes, two sisters shivering, silent, about to change everything he thought he knew about Mercy, and about himself. If the forgotten stories of the Old West still stir something quiet in you, stay a while longer, subscribe, and ride with us. There's more to this tale than the wind will tell. The wind had turned cruel that evening. It came rolling across the open plains, dragging sheets of dust and rain behind it, bending the tall grass like waves on a restless sea. The boards of the old Grady Ranch creaked with every gust, and the lantern hanging by the door swung in a tired arc, its flame clawing to stay alive. Inside, the smell of smoke and coffee lingered. A single chair scraped against the floorboards. Boots crossed the porch slow, deliberate, like every step carried the weight of another year gone by. Thomas Grady paused at the edge of the veranda, struck a match, and watched the flame bite into the cold. For a moment, the wind almost stole it away. He cupped his hand, lit the end of his cigarette, and leaned against the rail. The sky to the west was split with lightning wide and white, cutting through the dark like a scar. Thunder followed, rolling low across the fields, echoing in the hollow places between the hills. Thomas watched it all without a word. His coat collar lifted with the wind. The brim of his hat cast his eyes in shadow. Somewhere down the valley, a shutter banged against a wall, the only sound brave enough to break the quiet. He took a slow drag, then exhaled. The smoke twisted into the night and vanished before it reached the rain. On the table beside him sat a worn leather glove, the left one, the fingers still stiff with old mud. He hadn't worn the pair in months. The other glove was buried with her beneath the cottonwood tree by the creek. A horse neighed from the barn, uneasy. The storm was moving closer now, the kind that tore fences, flattened barns, and stripped the earth bare. Thomas didn't move. He let the rain find him, small cold drops landing on his sleeve, darkening the fabric, one by one. Behind him, the door rattled on its hinges. A loose nail scraped the wood each time the wind shifted. He'd been meaning to fix it, same as a dozen other things around the place. But lately, work had no shape, no reason. He mended the fences, he fed the horses, he rode out to check the cattle, then came back to the same quiet, the same ghosts waiting at sundown. A crack of thunder made the dog bark once, short and sharp, then fall silent. Thomas turned his gaze toward the horizon. The storm's edge was near a wall of gray, swallowing what little light the evening had left. He remembered another storm once, years back, when his wife had laughed at the way he cursed the rain for ruining the hay. Her voice had filled the house then. Now, the wind filled it instead. He ground the cigarette out against the rail and flicked it into the yard. The ember rolled once, glowed faintly, then went dark. The smell of wet earth rose up as the first real drops began to fall, heavy, relentless. Thunder cracked again, closer this time, and lightning flashed across the field, lighting up the skeleton of an old windmill, the one that hadn't turned since the drought. Thomas stepped down from the porch and crossed the yard, his boots sinking into the softening dirt. He unlatched the barn door, pushed it open, and the horses shifted, restless under the dim light. He patted the flank of the nearest mare, his wife's horse, once, and murmured something low, a habit more than a thought. The animal pressed its head against his shoulder, warm breath against his neck. It was the only thing in that place that still felt alive. When he came back outside, the world had turned to silver and shadow. Rain lashed against the ground, and the horizon disappeared. He lifted his head to it, not in defiance, not in prayer, just to feel something stronger than the emptiness that had followed him for too long, far off. The faint jingle of a loose chain swung in the wind. The sound came from the fence line, half a mile down. He hesitated, looked that way for a moment, then turned back toward the porch. But something, maybe a flash of light, maybe just instinct, made him stop. He could have sworn he saw movement through the rain, a dark shape, there and gone again between the curtains of water, too far to be clear, too still to be the wind. Thomas narrowed his eyes. The rain stung his face, and the thunder rolled over his thoughts. He waited. Nothing. Probably just a branch, he muttered, though the words were swallowed before they left his lips. He climbed the porch steps again, shaking the rain from his hat. The door protested when he closed it, hinges groaning like an old man's bones. Inside, the fire in the stove hissed as a drop of rain found its way through the chimney. He added another log, watched the flames lick the wood and settle into a steady glow. For a long time, he stood there listening, to the wind, to the rain, to the ache in his chest that never really left. He took the rifle from above the mantel, checked the chamber, and set it beside the door. A habit, like saying grace to an empty room. Outside, the storm grew wild, the kind that erased the line between sky and earth. He sat by the window, eyes tracing the horizon one more time. The lightning flashed again, and for a heartbeat, he saw it, a carriage, old, sagging, half swallowed by the dark, crawling its way through the storm, heading straight for the Grady Ranch. The thunder followed, deep and slow, like a warning from the mountains. Thomas stayed still, hand resting on the rifle stock, eyes fixed on that faint, impossible outline. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "No one rides in weather like this." And somewhere between the wind and the rain, a new story began to move. Quiet at first, but coming closer, the rain hadn't stopped. It came in long, slanted lines now, slicing across the yard, turning the ground to thick, sucking mud. The lantern on the porch swayed harder than before, its flame a pale heart beating in the storm. Thomas stood by the doorway, hand on the rifle, eyes fixed on the darkness where the plains met the sky. That was when he saw it again. What he'd thought was a shadow earlier wasn't just the storm playing tricks. There, between flashes of lightning, a wagon moved, slow and heavy, pulled by a horse that looked about ready to collapse. The wheels groaned in the mud, the axles screamed. Whoever was inside had no business being out here tonight. He stepped off the porch, the wind cutting into his coat. Rain stung his face, cold and sharp. The closer the wagon came, the clearer he could see its shape, old, battered, wood swollen from years of weather. The horse stumbled once, caught itself, then kept going. Thomas raised his lantern, shielding it from the rain. "Hold it there," he called out, voice nearly swallowed by the wind. The wagon jerked to a stop. For a moment, only the storm answered. Then came a cough, weak, from the driver's seat. A man slumped over the reins, soaked through, his hat plastered to his head. Thomas moved closer. "You lost!" he shouted. The man didn't answer. Lightning tore the sky again, and in that white flash, Thomas saw the stranger's face pale, gaunt, and still, dead or near enough. The reins slipped from his hands. The horse snorted, stamping nervously. Thomas caught the bridle, steadied the animal, then reached up and pulled the wagon's flap aside. Inside were two figures, huddled together beneath a torn blanket. One lifted her head just enough for him to see her eyes dark, wide, trembling. She looked about 16. The other, a little older, clutched the younger girl close. Her lips blue from the cold. Thomas lowered the lantern closer. "You all right in there?" he asked, softer this time. Neither spoke. The older one blinked, then looked past him to the man slumped on the front bench. Her voice came out small, hoarse. He said, "This is where we'd be left." Thomas frowned. Left. The girl reached into her coat, fingers shaking, and pulled out a crumpled paper. She handed it to him with both hands, careful like it might break. The rain smeared the ink, but one line still read, "Clear recipient, Thomas Grady. 2 female laborers, property transferred." The words cut through him like the cold wind. He looked back at the 2 girls, skin tanned by sun, hair black and heavy with rain. Apache, by the look. Too young to be out here, too quiet to be anything but scared. He crumpled the paper in his fist. "You've got the wrong man," he muttered, but the horse was trembling. The dead driver slumped lifeless, and the storm was worsening. Lightning split the air again, closer now, so bright it lit the fields like daylight. Thomas didn't think anymore. He just reached for the older girl's arm. "Come on, both of you. Inside." The younger hesitated, clutching her sister's sleeve. Thomas softened his tone. "You'll freeze out here." They followed, small steps sinking into the mud, their thin dresses soaked to the bone. By the time they reached the porch, the wind was howling through the eaves, the lantern flickering near dead. Inside, the warmth hit them like a memory. The stove crackled, the smell of smoke and coffee still hanging in the air. Thomas shut the door hard, dropped the bar across it. The older girl stood near the fire, but didn't move closer, her hands hovering over the heat like she wasn't sure she was allowed. The younger one trembled, teeth chattering. Thomas grabbed a blanket from the chair, held it out. "Here, wrap this around her." The older girl took it without a word. When her fingers brushed his, he felt how cold she was, bone-deep cold. He poured coffee into a tin cup and set it near the stove. "Drink slow," he said. "It'll warm you some." They sat on the floor, side by side, the firelight painting their faces in gold and shadow. Thomas leaned against the wall, arms crossed, the crumpled paper still in his hand. He didn't speak for a while. The wind filled the silence, rattling the window panes, hissing through the cracks. Finally, the older girl said, "He told us. We belonged here. Said we owed money. Said you'd take us." Her English was careful, each word chosen like a step over ice. Thomas's jaw tightened. "You don't owe me a damn thing." He looked toward the window, rain streaming down the glass. "And I don't take people." The younger one, still clutching the blanket, looked up at him. "Then why did he bring us?" Thomas didn't answer. The fire popped, sending a spark up the chimney. He stared at it, the flame twisting, reaching, dying back. The memory of that paper felt heavy in his pocket. Outside, the storm roared on, but something quieter was building inside the small house, not fear exactly, but something close. He turned back to them. "What are your names?" The older girl hesitated, then said, "Clara." She nodded toward the younger. "June." Thomas gave a slow nod. "There's food in the cupboard. Get dry first." They didn't move. Clara's eyes followed him as he crossed the room, took the rifle from the table, and set it back above the mantel. Every motion he made was slow, deliberate, as if to show he meant no harm. He fetched another blanket, set it by their feet, then crouched near the fire to feed it another log. The light flared up, warm and soft against the walls. When he looked up again, Clara was watching him, not like someone afraid anymore, but like someone trying to understand a thing that didn't fit. Outside, the thunder had drifted farther away. The worst of it was passing, though the rain still whispered against the roof. Thomas leaned back on his heels, eyes half closed against the glow. "You can stay tonight," he said finally. "After that, we'll see." Clara nodded once, barely. June curled closer to the fire, eyes drooping. For the first time in years, the old house held more than one heartbeat. The sound of rain softened, and the wind found a quieter tune against the walls. Thomas sat there a long while after they had gone still, the paper now crumbling into ashes in the stove. He didn't watch it burn, just listened to the crackle, to the breath of two strangers sleeping near his fire. And when the next gust came down from the hills, he thought he heard something in it, not the storm anymore, but something lighter, like the sound of change finding its way through the rain. The fire had burned low, its glow soft and unsteady, flickering against the worn boards of the cabin walls. Rain still whispered outside, a gentler rhythm now, like a heartbeat fading into sleep. Thomas sat in the old chair by the stove, elbows on his knees, eyes half closed. The smell of smoke, wet wool, and horse leather lingered in the air. Somewhere behind him, one of the girls stirred. He didn't turn. He only listened to the creak of the wood, to the shallow breaths of two strangers who'd found warmth where they weren't meant to. The thought pressed on him heavier than the storm. He'd fought wars, buried friends, watched men trade others like cattle. He'd told himself those days were over, that the world still had corners untouched by that kind of rot. Now, sitting here, that piece of paper had proved him wrong. The older one, Clara, rose quietly, moving toward the stove. Her wet hair clung to her neck, and when she reached to feed the fire another stick, her hands trembled. Not from fear, Thomas thought, but from the cold that lives long after rain stops. He caught her glance, brief and guarded. There was something in it, pride, even in exhaustion, that made him look away first. "You can dry your clothes near the back room," he said. His voice came out rough, low. "Ain't much, but it's warm." Clara nodded but didn't move. June slept beside the fire, face hidden beneath the blanket. Outside, a gust of wind pushed against the door. The latch rattled, and Thomas stood, pressing it firm. Habit made him check the lock twice, then glance through the window. Nothing but rain and darkness. Still, the air carried that uneasy quiet that comes after troubles, past the kind that makes a man listen harder. He walked back to his chair, but the girl's eyes followed him. He could feel it, the question hanging in the air. What now? He didn't know. His gaze landed on the paper again, edges curled and damp from his pocket. Recipient Thomas Grady. The ink had bled, but the meaning was clear enough. The man who'd brought them here had done so under some twisted bargain, believing Thomas the sort who'd accept such a thing. Maybe once, he might have looked the other way, but not now. Thomas reached for the poker, stirred the fire, and the sparks leapt high, scattering gold light across the room. "Was he your kin?" he asked without looking at Clara. She hesitated. No. Her voice was quiet, almost lost under the crackle. "He worked for men who collect debts. My father owed. He died before he could pay." Thomas nodded slowly, eyes still on the flames. He'd heard that story before, too many times, told by men and women, left with nothing but someone else's promise. After a while, he said, "You're safe here tonight. That's all I can promise." She looked down, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "That's more than most." The room fell silent again. Only the rain and the fire spoke. Thomas leaned back, his shoulders heavy. He thought of the law, what it said, what it didn't. Out here, far from the towns and courts, men made their own rules, and justice was as changeable as the wind. Still, there was a line he'd drawn long ago. The day he buried his wife, he would never again be a man who took from the helpless. He'd seen too much of that in uniform, too much blood on the ground that didn't need spilling. He rubbed a hand over his face, the roughness of his beard scratching his palm. Clara watched him from across the fire, her eyes steady, curious in a way that made him uneasy. Not distrustful, just studying him, the way someone studies a path they might have to walk. "Do you have family?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. He gave a faint shake of the head. "Had." She nodded once, as if that was answer enough. The firelight flickered between them, softening the hard lines of the room. For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain softened to a drizzle, and the night settled around the cabin like a blanket drawn tight. Thomas stared at the door, half expecting another knock, another storm waiting outside, but none came, only the quiet weight of what had already arrived. He rose to his feet, the floor creaking under his boots. "You can take the bed," he said, nodding toward the small back room. "I'll stay out here." Clara hesitated again, then stood, lifting her sister in her arms, light as a bird, wrapped in the blanket. Thomas stepped aside, holding the door open. When she passed, he caught the faint scent of smoke and rain from her hair. It carried him back to another storm, another night long ago, when his wife had whispered his name in the dark before the fever took her voice. He shut the thought away. Clara laid June down and turned back to face him. "Thank you," she said simply. Thomas gave a short nod. "Get some rest." He closed the door softly behind her. Then he sat again, alone with the fire and the rain. The paper still lay on the table, a reminder of how the world liked to twist mercy into property. He reached for it one last time, fed it to the flames, and watched it curl, blacken, disappear. Ash drifted up the chimney like gray snow. Outside, the wind shifted less angry now, more like breath easing after a long cry. Thomas leaned back in his chair. The firelight shimmered against the window, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement again. Not a wagon this time, just the reflection of the room, the empty chair across from him, the ghost of his wife's shawl still hanging on the peg. He reached out, touched the fabric once, then let his hand fall. For the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. Somewhere in the back room, a floorboard creaked. Maybe it was the girls settling in, or maybe just the house remembering what warmth felt like. Either way. Thomas listened to it a while longer, the faint sound carrying through the quiet. And when he finally closed his eyes, the wind outside had turned gentle, not gone, just changed, like something that had lost its anger, but not its purpose. The storm left the land washed clean. By morning, the air smelled of wet sage and mud, the kind that sticks to your boots but softens under the sun. The clouds had torn open, letting in wide strips of light that shimmered across the prairie grass. It was quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes after the world's had enough of noise. Thomas stood at the fence line, one hand resting on the rail, watching the horses nose through puddles. The sky stretched forever, pale blue, with a few scraps of gray drifting east. Behind him, smoke curled from the chimney, thin, steady, almost fragile. It was strange to see smoke rising again. For months, the stove had burned only for him, and not every day at that. Inside the house, faint sounds carried through the open window, the scrape of a chair leg, water poured into a basin, soft voices, two of them moving in and out of the silence like a tune half remembered. Thomas listened a while before going back to his work. He hitched the harness onto the mare, checked the gate, then led her out toward the pasture. The earth was heavy underfoot, every few steps. He looked up, as if expecting the storm to circle back, but it didn't. It just left behind a day that felt too still for its own good. By the time he returned, the sun was higher, throwing gold against the window glass. The door was open, and Clara stood there, sleeves rolled to her elbows, wiping the table with a damp cloth. June knelt near the stove, feeding small twigs to the fire. They moved without speaking much, quiet, careful, like guests afraid to make a sound too loud. Thomas paused on the porch, hat in hand. The smell of cornbread met him halfway, sweet and unfamiliar in his kitchen. "You didn't have to," he said from the doorway. Clara looked up, not startled, just measuring him. The way she did everything. "We wanted to," she said. Her voice was soft but sure. June gave a small nod without looking away from the stove. Thomas stepped inside, boots leaving small prints of dried mud on the floorboards. "You'll find this place dull," he muttered. Clara wrung the cloth, hung it over the chair back. "Quiet isn't dull," she said. "Quiet means safe." He didn't answer, just moved to hang his hat on the peg by the door. beside the shawl that had gathered more dust than memory. For a while, they shared the room in silence. The fire popped. The kettle hissed. Thomas poured himself coffee and sat down. Clara set out 3 tin plates, a small gesture, but it caught him off guard. He wasn't used to someone thinking of him in the count. June glanced at him once, then at her sister, as if asking permission before she sat. Clara gave a slight nod. The bread was rough, uneven, but warm. Thomas broke a piece, chewed slow. He didn't say thank you, but the way he reached for another told them enough. After breakfast, Clara took the bucket and went out to fetch water from the well. Thomas watched through the window the way she moved, steady but cautious, scanning the open field like someone who'd learned to be careful even in daylight. June followed close, her small frame nearly swallowed by the bucket's handle. Thomas found himself standing by the door, watching them longer than he meant to. The land looked different with figures moving across it, not just animals or wind, but people, the kind of difference you don't notice until it's been gone too long. He turned away and busied himself with the saddle straps. Still, their voices faint, mixed with the creak of the well, drifted back to him, like a memory that wouldn't stay buried. By noon, the wind had dried the last of the mud. The sun sat high, warm enough to make the earth smell alive again. Thomas hitched the wagon, checked the fences, worked through the motions that had shaped his days for years. But there was a weight missing the kind of emptiness he used to carry without noticing. He caught himself once, smiling at the sound of June laughing when a chicken startled her near the barn. It was a small sound, light, out of place among the steady rhythm of hammers and hooves. He shook his head, half a smile still hanging there. When the shadows began to stretch long, Clara came out with a folded blanket. "You left this by the stove," she said. Thomas took it from her, nodding. "Didn't think I'd need it." She looked toward the horizon where the sun was sinking slow behind the ridge. "The nights here get cold fast." He followed her gaze. The sky was a wash of gold and amber, clouds rimmed with fire. "They do," he said quietly. They stood there for a moment, not speaking, not moving, just listening to the sound of the world settling for the night. Clara turned first, heading back toward the house. Her braid swung low against her back. Thomas watched her go, then looked out across the fields again. The fences held. The herd was calm. The storm had passed, but something inside him was stirring, something that didn't quite know its name yet. When he went inside, June was sitting by the window, sewing a tear in the curtain with a thread she'd found somewhere. The rhythm of her small hands, the faint hum under her breath, it filled the space that used to be hollow. Thomas hung his coat, stood by the doorway, unsure why he couldn't just walk past. The air smelled of wood smoke and soap, of supper cooking slow on the stove. "Do you want me to put this back?" June asked, holding up the repaired curtain. He nodded. "Looks better than it ever did." Her smile was shy, but real. The sun faded, and the first stars began to show. Clara lit the lantern, its glow spilling across the room, warm and steady. Thomas sat in his chair by the fire, boots off, hat resting on his knee. For the first time in a long while, he didn't dread the quiet. It didn't feel empty anymore. The wind outside brushed against the windows, soft as breath. Clara passed behind him, laying a folded quilt over the back of the chair. June hummed something faint, a tune Thomas didn't recognize, maybe from somewhere far south, where the land turned red and dry. He closed his eyes. The sound drifted through him, easy, unforced. When he opened them again, the lantern's light had dimmed. The 2 girls were asleep near the hearth, heads resting close, the fire throwing a slow pulse of light across their faces. Thomas looked at them a long while, not as strangers now, but as something his house had been waiting for without knowing it. He leaned back, the old chair creaking beneath him. Outside, the prairie breathed under the stars. The wind shifted once, carrying the faint scent of rain still hiding somewhere beyond the ridge. And though he didn't know it yet, the quiet that filled that little house wasn't the kind that lasts forever. It was the quiet before the world begins to turn again. The sun was lowering slow over the fields, spilling gold across the tall grass and the fences that leaned with age. The air held that quiet warmth that only comes after a long day of work, the kind that smells of dust, sweat, and cut hay. Thomas stood by the corral, sleeves rolled up, running a rough hand along the flank of the mare. She flicked her tail, shifting her weight. Restless in the cooling light, Clara was at the fence, her elbows resting on the rail. June sat cross-legged nearby, humming low, tying bits of wildflower into her hair. The world had gone soft for a while, the kind of softness that makes a man forget he's lonely. Thomas set the brush aside, straightened, and glanced toward the horizon. The line of hills was deepening to copper, the clouds brushed with violet. It looked like rain far to the south, but not here, not tonight. He wiped his brow with the back of his arm, turned to find Clara watching him. She didn't look away this time. There was something in her eyes he hadn't seen before, not fear, not suspicion, just thought. The sort of thought that asks more than words dare. She spoke finely, her voice low, almost carried off by the wind. "Why'd you help us?" Thomas paused, leaning both hands on the fence rail. The boards were warm beneath his palms, rough with years of sun and weather. He didn't answer right away. A hawk circled above the pasture, cutting slow loops through the amber sky. When he did speak, his tone was quiet, the words drawn out like he was still weighing each one. "Because everyone," he said, "ought to have a place to start again." The wind caught the edge of his shirt, snapping it lightly, and Clara turned her face away not to hide, but to let the moment settle. The sun lit the side of her face, and for a second, Thomas saw her not as a stranger or a burden left by fate, but simply as someone trying to survive the same world he was. June laughed at something the horse did, a quick, bright sound that didn't belong to the silence, but didn't disturb it either. Clara smiled faintly, a brief flicker, almost lost in the light. Thomas reached for his gloves, pulled them tight. "You two been working hard," he said. "You don't have to." Clara's gaze returned to him, steady now. "Work makes us remember we're still people," she said. He nodded once, as though the words had landed somewhere deep. The evening light bent through the dust in the air, each mote shining for a heartbeat before fading. A cowbell clanged somewhere out near the ridge. The smell of baking bread drifted from the house, June's doing. Most likely, Thomas hadn't tasted bread made by someone else's hands in years. He turned toward the barn. Storm took down the south fence. He said, "Tomorrow I'll need another set of hands if you're up to it." Clara hesitated, brushing dirt from her sleeve. "I can help." He gave a slow nod. "All right, then." They fell quiet again. The sound of the evening took over, cicadas rising from the grass, the faint clatter of tin from the windmill, the kind of music you only hear when life slows enough to let it play. Thomas leaned against the fence post, feeling the rough grain dig into his back. He thought of what he'd said, a place to start again. He wasn't sure why those words had come, or whether he believed them for himself. But seeing Clara there, framed in the last light of day, he figured maybe it wasn't about belief at all. Maybe it was just something a man should do while he's still breathing. Clara looked toward the horizon again. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "Miss what?" "The world before," she said, "before all this." He thought about it, about the fields he'd ridden through in his youth, the laughter that used to live in this house, the sound of a woman's voice calling his name through the open door. He took a slow breath. "Sometimes," he said, "but missing it don't bring it back." She nodded, eyes fixed on the last strip of sunlight burning across the land. "My father used to say the same thing." Thomas looked at her then. Really looked, saw the line of grief behind her composure, the way she stood half in shadow, half in light. There was strength there, but also something brittle, like glass that had held too much weight for too long. He wanted to say something more, something to ease the silence stretching between them, but the right words wouldn't come. So he just nodded toward the house. "Come on in. Bread'll burn if we stay out here jawing." Clara smiled faintly. You'd know about that. He allowed himself a small grin. Let's just say I've ruined my share. They started walking back, side by side. June skipped ahead, her laughter rising into the dusk. The air cooled fast as the sun slipped below the hills, leaving behind streaks of pink fading into blue. At the porch, Thomas paused, wiping his boots against the step. The lantern inside flickered, throwing long shadows across the doorway. He held the door for them, not out of habit, but because it felt right. Clara nodded as she passed. Inside, the warmth met them again, rich with the smell of supper. June was already at the table, breaking the loaf with her hands. Thomas sat down, the old chair creaking beneath his weight. Clara poured coffee, the steam curling between them. For a while, they ate in quiet contentment. The clink of tin, the crackle of the stove. It sounded almost like family, though no one said so. When they'd finished, Clara stood, gathering the dishes. Thomas leaned back, eyes half closed, letting the sound of her footsteps fill the space where the wind used to live. Outside, the first coyotes had started to sing, their calls echoing across the darkening plain. Thomas listened, not with the old ache of loneliness, but with something closer to peace. Clara's voice came softly from the sink. Maybe this is our place to start again. He didn't look up right away, just smiled faintly, fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. Maybe it is, he said. The lantern light wavered, then steadied, casting a soft glow on their faces. June yawned, curling up in her chair. Thomas stood, stretched, and crossed to the window. The night outside was wide and open, the stars sharp against the dark. He rested a hand on the frame, feeling the cool wood beneath his fingers. Somewhere deep inside, something had shifted, not loud, not certain, just enough to remind him the world hadn't ended after all. He turned back toward the room, toward the soft hum of life beginning again under his roof. The old clock ticked once, slow and sure, and in that sound, the evening settled, not finished, not forgotten, but at peace. Morning came soft and clear, the kind that settled over the plains like a slow breath after prayer. The light crept through the thin curtains, tracing the rough boards of the floor, touching the stove, the table, the old rifle on its rack. Somewhere outside, a meadowlark sang. Its call floated in through the open window, thin and bright, stirring the air that still smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee. Thomas sat at the table, whittling a piece of pine. The sound of his knife against the grain was steady, unhurried, across the room. Clara was mending the curtain by the window. Her stitches were even, the thread white against the faded cloth. Each pull of the needle brought the fabric back together, slow but sure, like healing done by hand. June crouched by the door, working on a bow she'd shaped from a branch of ash wood. She tested the string, drew it halfway, and smiled a small, private smile that said she knew exactly what she was doing. Thomas caught her reflection in the window and couldn't help the ghost of a grin that tugged at his own mouth. The girl had skill, and a quiet kind of confidence that didn't ask for praise. The day moved gently, the house filled with those soft sounds that only come when people are at peace, the creak of a chair, a low hum under Clara's breath, the occasional scrape of a plate. For the first time in years, Thomas didn't feel the walls closing in around him. The silence no longer pressed it, breathed. By noon, he was out in the yard, fixing a broken post. The sun was high, and the air shimmered above the fields. Clara brought him water in a tin cup, her hands still smelling of soap and flour. He took it, nodding in thanks. "You work too hard," she said lightly. Thomas drank deep, then smiled without looking up. "Work's the only thing that never left me." She leaned on the fence, watching him drive the nail with steady swings of the hammer. The rhythm echoed across the quiet land. Thunk, pause, thunk, and somewhere between the strikes, she said softly, "It's strange, to feel safe again." He stopped mid-swing, the nail half buried. The air around them seemed to hold still. He set the hammer down. "Safe's a word I ain't heard in a while," he said. She didn't answer, just stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked back toward the house. The afternoon stretched long. June went hunting in the meadow beyond the ridge, her small figure moving through the grass with a grace that surprised him. By sunset, she returned with 2 rabbits tied to her belt, proud and flushed from the run. Thomas helped her clean them, both of them working in the quiet rhythm of the knife's motion. Clara stood nearby, watching, a look between admiration and worry in her eyes. When supper was ready, the sky outside was painted with streaks of red and violet. The 3 of them sat around the table, their shadows long against the walls. June talked about the deer tracks she'd found near the creek, her words quick and bright. Clara listened, smiling faintly, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. Thomas mostly listened, though once or twice he caught himself chuckling under his breath, the sound of it startling even him, the kind of laugh that had rusted from disuse. After supper, Clara stood and began to wash the dishes. Thomas moved to help, but she shook her head. "You've done enough," she said, her tone soft but firm. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. The light from the lamp fell on her hands, glinting on the soap bubbles, the worn metal of the basin. She worked with quiet focus, her movements steady, graceful in their simplicity. June was on the floor by the fire, skinning the rabbits she'd caught, humming the same tune she'd been humming for days. Now something wordless and sad, yet somehow filled with hope. Thomas recognized it as an Apache melody, one he'd heard long ago from a campfire far out on the plains, before the soldiers came and turned song into silence. The sound of it brought back memories he'd tried to bury, faces half lit by firelight, the smell of smoke, the weight of orders he hadn't believed in but had followed anyway. His hand tightened around the doorframe, a flicker of guilt passing through him like shadow over sun. Clara must have felt his stillness. She glanced up. "You all right?" He nodded, forcing the tightness from his chest. "Just tired?" She didn't press, just turned back to her work, her hum joining June's. For a brief moment, 2 soft voices filling the air where ghosts once lingered. When the chores were done, Thomas pulled a chair near the stove. The girls settled beside the fire. The night outside was calm, the moon rising pale and full above the ridge. The sound of crickets blended with the faint whistle of wind through the cracks in the walls. June was the first to speak. "My mother used to sing that song," she said, looking into the flames. "Said it keeps bad spirits away." Thomas nodded slowly. "Seems to be working." June smiled, and Clara's eyes softened. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You remember much of where you came from?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Enough," she said. "The hills, the smell of mesquite after rain. My father carving arrows by the fire. We didn't have much, but it was ours." Her words hung there a moment, fragile as smoke. Thomas didn't speak. He just let the image sink into him, a life stolen, a memory that refused to die. He thought of all the land around them, empty now, but once alive with people who'd known its every shadow. He'd been part of the reason it wasn't that way anymore. For a while, the only sound was the pop and crackle of the wood. Then Clara said quietly, "We thought everyone forgot us." Thomas looked up, his face lit by the fire. "Not everyone," he said. Clara met his gaze, and something unspoken passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the kind of understanding that has the shape of it. June yawned, curling up on the rug, her small hand clutching the edge of the blanket. Clara rose to tuck it around her. The movement was gentle, practiced the kind that comes from years of being someone's keeper. Thomas watched her, the soft light tracing the curve of her profile, the calm strength in her shoulders. The ache in his chest eased, though it didn't vanish. He stood, banked the fire, and turned down the lamp. Before stepping away, he said quietly, "This house was quiet too long. It's good to have the noise back." Clara smiled at that, a real one this time, small, but true. He went to the window, looking out over the dark fields. The moonlight lay silver across the land, and the wind whispered through the grass like breath against skin. Behind him, he heard the faint rustle of cloth as Clara sat by the fire again, the rhythmic whisper of her weaving filling the room like a heartbeat. Thomas closed his eyes, just for a moment, letting that sound root itself deep inside him. For the first time in many years, he didn't dread the coming morning. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote called, distant and low, and Thomas Grady, who'd once believed life had already passed him by, felt something stir quietly within a small pulse of warmth, steady and alive, like the glow from the last coal in a long-burning fire. The nights had turned quieter, but not in the easy way. There was a kind of stillness that pressed on the house after sundown, too deep, too careful, like the land itself was holding its breath. The summer wind had grown warmer, dry and restless, carrying dust across the porch and sighing through the cracks in the doorframe. Thomas sat by the fire that evening, running his thumb along the worn edge of his coffee cup, listening to the sound of the wind drag across the plains. The girls were near the hearth, their shadows soft and long against the wall. June was mending a small tear in her coat, her needle flashing in the firelight. Clara sat beside her, braiding a strip of leather, her fingers moving with quiet rhythm. It was the kind of scene a man could get used to, the hum of life, returning to a place that had forgotten it. But when Clara spoke, the warmth in the room shifted. "Mr. Grady," she said softly, eyes still on her hands. "They'll come." Thomas looked up, not sure he'd heard right. She didn't look at him, just kept working the braid, her voice low and steady. "The men who sold us, they'll come looking. They always do." The wind moaned in the chimney. The fire popped, sending a trail of sparks toward the ceiling. Thomas set his cup down. How would they know where Clara's hands paused? The man who brought us? He wasn't the kind to let money go. They'll ask around. Someone'll talk. June glanced up at her sister, worry flickering across her young face. "We could leave," she whispered. Thomas said nothing. The thought of them out there, two girls alone on the plains, was a thought he couldn't bear to finish. He rose from his chair and crossed to the window. The night outside was wide and empty, the horizon lost in the dark. He could feel it, though the weight of something coming, slow but sure, like thunder you can't yet hear. He turned back to them. "You're safe here," he said. Clara shook her head, the firelight catching in her eyes. "Safe's not real for people like us," she said quietly. "It lasts until someone decides otherwise." The words hit harder than she knew. Thomas leaned a shoulder against the wall, his jaw tightening. He remembered other nights, other faces, the war camps, the orders barked by men who believed they owned the world and everything breathing in it. He'd stood by once, telling himself there was nothing he could do. That was a long time ago. He wasn't that man anymore. He said, "You have my word. No one's taken you from here." Clara's eyes lifted to his. For the first time since she'd arrived, there was no fear there, only something else, something heavier. June looked between them, unsure, then reached for the kettle, refilling Thomas's cup with small, careful hands. The smell of coffee and smoke filled the room again, grounding them back in the moment. Outside, a coyote called from the ridge, one long note that hung in the night air. Clara's shoulders tensed at the sound. Thomas moved toward the door, checking the latch out of habit. "You two get some rest," he said. "I'll keep the fire up." Clara hesitated before standing. "You can't fight them all, Mr. Grady." He gave a slow nod. "Maybe not, but I can make it hard to try." She studied him for a breath, then nodded once and guided June toward the back room. When the door closed behind them, the cabin felt different. The air was heavier now, not lonely, but watchful. Thomas sat again, staring into the fire. The wood crackled, light flickering across his hands. They were rough, scarred, the hands of a man who'd built fences, dug graves, and buried more than just the dead. He reached for the rifle leaning by the door, checking the chamber, the weight familiar against his palm. It wasn't the gun that brought comfort. It was the readiness, the knowing he wouldn't stand idle this time. The flames shifted, throwing long shadows across the floor. He thought of the men Clara spoke of, faces he hadn't seen but could imagine too well. The kind that made their living off the suffering of others. The kind who believed they'd never be held to account. He remembered the last time he'd felt that kind of anger years ago, when he still wore a uniform and believed justice was a word worth fighting for. The memory burned hot and quick, then faded to embers, leaving behind only the quiet resolve of a man who'd already lost too much. He stood and walked to the door, opened it just enough to feel the night press against his face. The wind was colder now, carrying the faint smell of rain far off. Somewhere in that darkness, something moved, maybe just the brush swaying, maybe not. He closed the door softly and dropped the bar back in place. The firelight flickered behind him. From the back room came the faint murmur of Clara's voice, low and soothing as she whispered to June. The sound settled in him like a promise he hadn't known he'd made. He sat again, the old chair creaking under his weight. The minutes passed slow. He watched the last log collapse into coals, glowing steady in the hearth. When sleep finally began to edge in, Thomas stirred. He got up once more, stepped outside with the rifle slung over his shoulder. The sky was clear now, a stretch of stars above the dark land. The barn loomed quiet. The horses shifted inside, tails swishing, uneasy with the scent of something unseen. Thomas stood by the porch rail, scanning the horizon. His breath came out white in the cool air. He stayed there a long time, until the cold bit through his shirt and the first hint of dawn began to color the sky. Then, before turning back in, he spoke softly into the wind, almost like a prayer, almost like a warning. Not this time. When he stepped back inside, Clara was standing in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket. Her hair was loose, her face half in shadow. "You didn't sleep," she said quietly. He shook his head. Didn't need to. For a moment, neither spoke. The firelight danced between them, drawing thin lines of gold across her eyes. Then she said, "They'll come from the east. They always ride from the east." Thomas met her gaze, steady, unflinching. "Then I'll be looking that way." Clara nodded once, then disappeared into the dim light of the back room. He listened to the door close, the soft rustle of the blanket as she lay down beside her sister. The wind picked up again, tapping at the window pane like a restless hand. Thomas set the rifle beside his chair, sat down, and waited for the morning. Outside, the first crow called from the fence post. The sky began to pale, and with it came a feeling he hadn't known in a long time. Not fear, not quite courage, but the space between them. The house, once a refuge, had turned into something else now. A line drawn in the dust. And as the sun broke over the ridge, Thomas Grady knew the quiet days were ending. The mornings had turned sharper, the kind that start with a gray sky and a silence that hangs too long, like the land itself is waiting for something it doesn't want to come. Thomas rose earlier these days. Before the first light touched the ridge, moving slow but steady through the motions, he knew by heart, check the stockroom, oil the hinges, count the cartridges twice. The air smelled of iron and dust, the kind of smell that told a man trouble wasn't far. June followed him out, most mornings, her bow slung over one shoulder, her boots leaving small prints beside his. She didn't talk much, neither did he. Words didn't seem to fit the space between them anymore. There was only the scrape of the shovel, the clink of a hammer, the breathing of the land as it braced itself. He'd rebuilt the fence too, 3 times that week, tightening the wire even where it didn't need it. Clara teased him for it. Once said the cows weren't going anywhere, but her smile never quite reached her eyes. She felt it too, the heaviness, the stillness that sits on your chest and makes you listen too close at night. Inside, the table was lined with small piles of things that didn't used to be there, tins of beans, jars of jerky, candles, bullets stacked in neat rows. Clara's hands worked quick and quiet, sealing each jar, tying each bundle of herbs. June counted every round. her small fingers tracing the brass like it was something sacred. Thomas didn't tell them to do any of it. They just knew. The sun came up blood orange through the haze, and the wind had lost its warmth. Thomas leaned against the barn door, rolling a cartridge between his fingers. June stood a few yards away, her bow raised. She'd tied her hair back with a strip of leather, her stance solid, the way a soldier stands before the recoil. "Steady," he said. She took a breath, loosed the arrow. It hissed through the air and struck the fence post clean, dead center. Thomas gave a short nod. Again. She smiled just a flicker, and not at the praise, but at the sound of it. It was the first word he'd spoken all morning. By noon, they'd moved to the rifle. June was small, but her hands were sure. Thomas crouched beside her, guiding her grip, the stock snug against her shoulder. "It'll kick some," he warned. She nodded once, not afraid. When she pulled the trigger, the sound cracked across the open field, scattering a flock of birds from the cottonwoods. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy. June lowered the rifle, eyes wide, not from fear, from understanding. Thomas took it back from her, working the lever, chambering another round. "You keep your breath steady," he said. "Don't rush the pull. Let the world hold still before you do." She nodded again, serious as any grown man. From the house, Clara watched through the window, her hands still in the dishwater. The look on her face wasn't pride or worry, it was something in between. She knew what Thomas was teaching her. Sister wasn't a skill for living, but for surviving. There's a difference, and she felt every inch of it. The afternoon heat came slow, pressing down on everything. The ranch was too quiet. Even the wind had forgotten its tune. Thomas stood by the porch, scanning the road that led east, a line of dust and distance. Nothing yet. He'd been through this kind of waiting before battles, before bad news, before death came wearing someone else's boots. The silence before it all was always the same, thick, restless, pretending to be peace. Clara stepped outside, drying her hands on her apron. "You think they're close?" Thomas didn't turn. "Close enough?" She swallowed hard, looking out at the empty road. "I can take June and go." "You don't have to." He cut her off with a shake of his head. "Ain't about have to." Clara's eyes softened, but she didn't argue. She knew that tone, the one that meant the words were already carved in stone. They stood there together, the light turning amber around them. The smell of hay and iron hung in the air. "After a long while," Thomas said, "when I was your sister's age, I thought the world made sense. Then the war came and proved me wrong. Nothing ever goes back right after that." Clara's voice was quiet. "Then why stay? Why fight?" He looked at her then, his gaze steady but not hard. "Because someone's got to." A long pause followed, the kind that sinks deep into the dust and stays there. June came running from the field, hair loose, breath quick. Riders, she called. Thomas was already moving before the word left her mouth. He crossed the yard in long strides, climbed the porch steps, and grabbed the rifle from where it leaned against the door. "How many? 3, June said, catching her breath. "Far off. East Ridge." He scanned the horizon. A thin line of movement cut across the hills, slow, deliberate. Could be anyone. Could be them. "Inside," he said. Clara took June by the arm, but June hesitated. "I can help." "Inside," Thomas repeated, softer this time, but firm. She obeyed, though her jaw was tight. The door closed behind them, the sound dull in the heavy air. Thomas stayed outside a while longer, eyes on the ridge. The riders didn't change course, just kept coming, their shape small but certain. The sun was low now, red light spilling across the land. He turned, walked to the barn, and started checking the horses, the harness, the tools. His hands moved with purpose, every motion part of a rhythm he'd lived too many times. Behind him, the door creaked open. June stood there again, holding something in both hands, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "I made more bullets," she said quietly. Clara helped, Thomas took it from her, the weight solid, familiar. Good work. She looked up at him, searching his face. Are we going to be all right? He hesitated just a second too long. Then he said, We will. June nodded, trusting him because she didn't know how not to. When she left, he stood alone in the barn a long time. The air was cool now, shadows stretching long across the floor. He leaned on the stall door, eyes closed, and let the memory of another battlefield flicker through him, men shouting, the smell of smoke, the ache of doing what you must even when you hate it. He opened his eyes. The light was nearly gone. He walked back to the house, the rifle slung across his shoulder, the last of the sun burning out behind him. Inside, the girls had set candles on the table. Their light flickered soft against the walls, turning the little kitchen into something that looked almost holy. Clara glanced up from the table. They're still coming. He nodded once. Slow. Won't reach here before morning. She looked down at her hands, then at the rifle in his. Then tonight's the last quiet we'll have. He didn't disagree. Outside, the wind picked up, low and rising, carrying dust from the ridge. Thomas went to the window, pulled the curtain aside. The stars were sharp above the plains. The land lay still, but he could feel it, that hum beneath everything, the one that comes before the world breaks loose. He set the rifle down gently by the door, looked once more toward the horizon, and whispered, Let it come. The candles flickered. The night held its breath, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled not from the sky, but from hooves still too far to see. The day was slipping quietly toward evening, that slow, honey-colored hour when the world seemed to breathe softer. The wind had calmed, the sky turned to gold, and everything, the fields, the barn, the weathered boards of the fence carried that glow that comes just before the dark. Thomas was in the barn, rolling a bit of hay between his fingers, listening to the steady rhythm of the horse's breath. The animals shifted gently in their stalls, tails flicking, hooves scraping now and then. He found peace there. The barn smelled of hay and leather, and something else, something old, honest, like time itself had gathered and settled in the dust. It was the one place where his thoughts didn't chase him, where silence didn't ask questions. June stood a few yards away, her bow in hand. The target was a rough board propped up against the far wall. She drew the string, squinted one eye, and let the arrow fly. It struck just shy of the center. The sound of it thudding into wood broke the stillness clean in two. Thomas watched her, saying nothing. She turned, her eyes searching his face for approval. He gave a single nod. Again, he said. June smiled faintly, not the girlish kind, but small, steady, the kind that meant she understood the work wasn't done. She drew another arrow from her quiver, notching it smooth and sure. The barn door was open wide, the evening light spilling in like melted amber. Dust motes danced in it, slow as drifting snow. Beyond the door, Clara was hanging laundry, her hands working rhythmically, her hair caught up in the wind. It was the first time in days she'd hummed a tune while she worked. June drew, aimed, and released. The arrow struck dead center. This time, Thomas smiled just barely. But it was enough. Good, he said. June lowered the bow. You really think they'll come? Thomas set the coil of rope down, rubbed his palm across the back of his neck. Don't much care what I think, he said. Best to be ready either way. She nodded, turning to retrieve the arrows. Her small boots scuffed the dirt, the hem of her dress dark with dust. When she came back, she lingered by him. Mr. Grady. He looked at her. Why'd you help us? Really? He didn't answer at first. The sound of the horses filled the pause, the soft blow of air through their nostrils, the quiet shift of hooves on straw. Finally, he said, I didn't help you. June frowned. You didn't. Thomas shook his head slowly. Did what any man ought to do. You came to my door cold, hungry, scared. That don't make it charity, just makes it right. June studied him, Her brow furrowed like she was trying to see past the words. He met her gaze, voice steady. I didn't save you out of pity. I just wanted you to live in a world where you didn't have to flinch every time the wind changed, where you could breathe without looking over your shoulder. His words hung there, soft and rough all at once, like leather left out in the sun too long. June didn't move. The light had shifted, catching her face in a soft orange glow. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said, "Nobody's ever said that to me before." Thomas gave a small nod. Maybe they should have. Outside, the sky deepened. The color of it turned from gold to copper, the kind of light that makes everything look both alive and fading at once. Clara came to the barn door, a basket of laundry in her arms. She stopped, seeing the two of them standing there, Thomas, with his hands resting easy on the fence rail, and June, her bow slack at her side, her face turned toward him. Something softened in Clara's expression. She didn't say a word, just watched the scene for a heartbeat longer, then turned and walked back toward the house. June looked down at the bow in her hands. "When my father died," she said quietly, "they said I'd have to work off his debt, that it was law." She looked up at him then, eyes wide, steady. "Is law always right?" Thomas exhaled slow. "Law's just words written by men. Men can be wrong." She tilted her head, thinking on that. "Then what's right?" He paused. "Sometimes it's the thing that costs you sleep. But you do it anyway." Her eyes softened, like taking us in. He didn't answer, but she saw the corner of his mouth shift, not quite a smile, but close. The wind outside had stilled completely. The world felt suspended, as if everything, the light, the dust, even time was holding still for just that one quiet breath. June stepped closer to the barn door, standing in the spill of sunlight. The glow touched her face, and for the first time since he'd known her, Thomas saw her smile, a real one, not shy, not cautious, just simple and clean, like sunlight breaking through a long storm. It changed something in him, not a revelation, not some grand turning, but a small warmth rising where cold had lived too long. "You should keep that," he said. She turned back, puzzled. "Keep what that smile. Don't let the world take it again." June's cheeks colored, and she ducked her head, pretending to fuss with her bowstring. Thomas reached for his hat, brushing the dust from the brim. "All right. Enough talk. Let's see if you can hit 2 in a row." Her grin widened quick, mischievous. The way youth always finds its way back when it's allowed. "Bet I can." He chuckled low, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. "Bet you can't." The air lightened between them. Not laughter, not yet, but close. June lifted the bow again, setting her feet just as he'd shown her. The arrow flew, then another. Both hit clean. Thomas nodded once, proud but quiet. As she ran to fetch them, the light in the barn turned soft and long, stretching the shadows into gold. Thomas leaned against the post, watching her, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, the easy ache of belonging. Outside, Clara called them in for supper, her voice carrying across the yard like a familiar song. Thomas tipped his hat toward the sound. Best not keep her waiting. June laughed under her breath. "She's worse than you when it comes to rules." "Good," he said. "World could use more of that." They walked back toward the house together, their boots stirring the dust. The sun was half gone behind the ridge, the last light laying gentle across the land. At the porch, June turned once, looking back at the barn. The glow from inside spilled out through the cracks in the boards, like fire caught in wood. She smiled again, small, secret, then followed Thomas inside. Behind them, the plains grew quiet. The wind rose once, whispering through the grass, then faded away. And for a little while, the world felt still caught between what was and what might yet be. The night came without stars. The sky was low and heavy, the kind of dark that made even the lantern light feel small. The wind had stopped moving, and the land around the Grady Ranch seemed to be holding its breath. Inside, the fire burned slow, quiet, steady. The only thing still alive in that silence. Thomas sat by the table, cleaning his rifle. The movements were deliberate, practiced, the kind that kept his hands busy while his mind wandered places he didn't care to go. Across from him, Clara folded blankets, one by one, laying them in a neat stack. June was curled up by the hearth, her bow resting across her knees, eyes half closed but listening to every sound. It had been like this for hours, no one speaking, all three of them caught in the same waiting, the kind that sits on your shoulders, heavier with each passing minute. A log cracked in the stove. The sound made Clara flinch, just barely. Thomas noticed. He looked up, the rifle resting across his lap. "You should try to sleep," he said quietly. Clara didn't look at him. "Can't," she murmured. June stirred, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. The firelight flickered across her face, soft and young, but her eyes had that faraway look, the kind that only comes from remembering too much. Clara finally spoke again, her voice barely more than a breath. "We should leave, Mr. Grady." Thomas paused mid-motion, the cloth frozen in his hand. She went on, steady but tired. "Before they get here. Before they find us. If we ride through the night, we can make it to the river by morning. Maybe cross before no." The words stopped her cold. Thomas laid the rifle down, leaned back in his chair. "If we go together. If we stay together." Clara turned toward him, her face lit by the dull orange glow. "You don't understand. They're not just men with debts to settle. They'll come armed, and they won't stop. You're risking your life for something that isn't your fight." He held her gaze. "It is now?" The room went quiet again. The wind outside brushed against the walls, low and long, like the sigh of something too big to see. June lifted her head, her voice soft. "He's right." Clara looked at her sister, startled. "June." The girl met her eyes, steady. "We've been running all our lives. Maybe it's time we don't." Thomas watched them both, the faintest flicker of pride passing through his eyes. He reached for the lantern, turned the wick lower. The shadows deepened, softening the room. "I've spent too many years letting things happen to other people," he said quietly. "Didn't stop the wrong ones then. Not making that mistake again." Clara's eyes softened, the anger melting into something else, sorrow, maybe, or gratitude too big to name. She walked to the window, pulled the curtain aside just enough to see outside. The land was nothing but dark shapes, the line of the hills faint against the horizon. No movement yet, no sound. But she could feel it that slow, creeping certainty that danger was already on its way. Thomas stood, stretched his back, and walked over to her. They stood side by side in silence, the distance between them smaller than it had ever been. "You could have turned us away," Clara said after a while. He nodded. "Could have? Why didn't you?" Thomas looked out at the empty fields, the wind stirring faintly through the dry grass. "'Cause I know what it's like," he said. "To lose everything and still be told you owe more." Her lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but no words came. The lantern flame fluttered, casting the two of them in the same thin light. Behind them, June's voice rose from the hearth, soft, hesitant. "If we stay, we fight." Thomas turned. "If we stay," he said, "we make sure no one here gets taken again." June nodded. "Then I'll fight." He smiled at that, not wide, just enough that it reached his eyes. "Reckon you already are." Outside, a branch scraped the side of the house, slow and hollow. Clara stepped back from the window. Thomas moved to the door, checked the bar, then returned to the table. He picked up his rifle again, checking the sights out of habit. "Sun'll be up in a few hours," he said quietly. "You should both get some rest while you can." Neither of them moved. Clara crossed her arms, staring at the floorboards. You really think we'll make it through? Thomas shrugged lightly. Don't think much on it. Just do what I can till I can't no more. That answer made her smile small, sad, but real. The clock on the mantel ticked slow. The sound was steady, like a heartbeat. June finally drifted to sleep, her head resting on her folded arms. Clara fetched a blanket, laid it over her sister's shoulders, then sat beside the fire. The light caught the curve of her face, the weariness etched in it, but also the strength that had carried her through too much already. Thomas leaned against the wall, watching the flames move. The heat pressed gently against his skin. In that small, quiet room, the three of them were more than what they had been before, not strangers, not burdens, not debts unpaid, just people trying to hold something good together before the world came knocking again. He thought about saying that out loud, but the words weren't needed. Instead, he said softly, "Tomorrow will come fast." Clara looked up. "Then we face it fast." He nodded once. The last of the fire settled into a glow. The room dimmed to amber and shadow. Outside, a low rumble rolled through the valley thunder. Or maybe hooves, too far yet to tell. The wind picked up again, carrying the smell of dust and the faint taste of rain. Thomas stepped to the window, lifted the curtain one last time. The horizon was still empty, but the feeling in the air had changed. He turned back toward the room, his voice low but certain. "Whatever happens, this is our place now." Clara's eyes met his across the fading light. "Ours," she echoed. For a long moment, the three of them existed in that silence, the kind that binds more than any promise could. The lamp flickered once, then steadied. The fire hummed low, and outside, the first wind of the coming storm whispered across the plains, a sound that wasn't yet danger, but close enough to taste. The moon hung low, pale and round, washing the land in silver. The air was thin, sharp with the scent of sage and cold iron. The three of them moved, slow Thomas in front, the sisters close behind, their steps quiet over the dry grass. The horses carried only what they needed: blankets, a little food, and the rifle that never left Thomas's hand. The rest, the house, the fences, the tools they'd left behind without looking back. The world felt hollow, like sound had gone missing from it. Only the creak of saddle leather, only the slow rhythm of hooves on dirt. Thomas looked over his shoulder once, checking the horizon. Nothing but dust and light. Yet his gut told him what his eyes couldn't see. They were coming. He'd known men like that, the kind who didn't speak much but carried the smell of violence with them. Debt collectors, bounty chasers, worse. They always came at night, always with a grin that didn't reach their eyes. He adjusted his hat, glanced at the girls. Clara rode steady, her face unreadable. June's fingers clutched the reins tight, her knuckles pale in the moonlight. "Keep your heads low," Thomas said softly. Neither answered, but they obeyed. The plains opened wide before them, rolling under that cold light. The northern hills looked close, though he knew they were still miles away. That was the trick of moonlight, made everything seem nearer than it was. A coyote called from somewhere far, then silence again. Thomas slowed his horse, listening. The wind brushed past, carrying something faint, a rhythm he couldn't mistake. Hoofbeats, not theirs, not far. He looked back once more. This time, he saw a trail of dust rising behind them, faint but growing. "Ride," he said. Clara's head snapped up. What ride? His voice was calm. Too calm. Now. June didn't ask twice. She dug her heels in, and the horses surged forward. The land blurred sagebrush, rock, dry gullies flashing by in the moonlight. Thomas stayed close behind, turning once to glance back. The riders were there now, dark shapes against the pale horizon. 5, maybe 6, moving fast. He knew they'd catch up before dawn. "Keep north," he called, toward the ridge. The wind whipped his voice apart, but they heard. Clara leaned low over her horse's neck, guiding it through the brush. June kept close, small and fierce, her braid snapping behind her. Then came the first gunshot. It cracked across the plains, echoing like thunder. The horses screamed, stumbling. Thomas turned, fired once into the dark. The muzzle flash lit his face for a heartbeat, hard, focused, unafraid. The riders answered with 3 more shots. Dust flew at their heels. They reached the base of the northern ridge, low hills lined with stone and shadow. Thomas raised a hand. Off the horses. They obeyed, sliding down quick. The animals snorted, restless. Up that way, he said, pointing to a narrow cut between 2 boulders. Go. Keep to the left. Clara hesitated. What about you? I'll be right behind. But he didn't move. She stared at him. Realization dawning. Thomas. He lifted the rifle, checked the chamber. Go. Her throat tightened. You'll die? He looked at her then, and there was a softness behind the steel in his eyes. Maybe, but you won't. June tugged her sister's sleeve. Clara. The riders were closer now. Voices carried on the wind, rough laughter, the clink of metal. Thomas turned toward the sound. Stepping into the open, the moon caught his outline, a tall, solitary figure against the pale dust. He crouched behind a fallen log, sighted down the rifle. The first man came over the rise, a shape on horseback, gun drawn. Thomas waited steady breath. 1 second, 2, then fired. The man dropped. The others spread out, shouting. Gunfire cracked through the night, flashes lighting up the brush. Thomas moved like he had back in the war, not with panic, but purpose. Each shot counted, each breath measured. Behind him, the sisters had reached the rocks. June turned once, eyes wide. She saw him there alone, a dark figure rimmed by silver light. Clara pulled her down. Don't look. But June couldn't help it. She'd never seen courage shaped like that, quiet, stubborn, without promise of reward. Another shot rang out, then another. The echoes rolled across the hills like storm waves. Thomas felt the sting of splintered wood against his cheek. A bullet tore through the brim of his hat. He didn't flinch. He fired back once, twice, and 1 more horse went down. Then there was silence again. Smoke drifted low across the ground. The smell of gunpowder clung to everything sharp, metallic, final. Thomas reloaded slow, his fingers slick with sweat. His breath came heavy, but his eyes stayed on the ridge. A shadow moved to his left too close. The man stepped out from behind a rock, pistol raised. Thomas turned, but the shot came first. The sound was small, almost swallowed by the wind. He stumbled, caught himself on the log, looked down. The red spreading across his shirt looked almost black in the moonlight. He lifted the rifle again anyway, aimed, fired. The man fell without a sound. Thomas sank back against the wood, the world tilting soft around him. The gun slipped from his hand. He could hear the wind again now, the plains breathing, the horses somewhere far off, restless. Then footsteps. Clara's voice, sharp with fear. Thomas. She was kneeling beside him before he could speak, her hands pressing against the wound, her face pale. June stood behind her, eyes glistening in the half-light. I told you to go, he said, his voice rough. Clara shook her head, tears streaking through the dirt on her cheeks. And leave you here. Never. Thomas tried to smile, but it came out as a sigh. Stubborn woman, she laughed through her tears. Guess we learned that from you. The moonlight caught on the rifle beside him. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cold metal. Take it, he whispered. You'll need it. June knelt beside him now, her small hands wrapping around his. You said we'd live without fear. He looked at her, really looked, and there was pride in his eyes, even through the pain. Then do it, he said. Live. The night stretched long and quiet. The wind moved through the grass like a song. When it was over, the plains were still again. The riders lay where they fell. The dust began to settle. The world vast, indifferent, carried on breathing. And in that quiet, the two sisters sat together beside the man who had given them back their lives. The moon slipped lower, soft and cold, spilling silver over the land, somewhere far off. A coyote cried, not mourning, just marking the hour. The wind shifted east, and the night, the long, heavy night, began to give way to the faintest trace of dawn. The morning came slow, soft, quiet. The kind of dawn that doesn't break, it just seeps in, like water through sand. The ridge was still gray when Clara opened her eyes. The air was cold, thin enough to sting her lungs. Dew clung to her lashes. For a moment, she didn't move. The world felt suspended, just wind, earth, and the faint sound of something small scurrying through the brush. June sat a few steps away, knees drawn to her chest, Thomas's hat held carefully in her lap. She hadn't said a word since the gunfire stopped. The brim of the hat was torn, dark at the edge where blood had soaked through. Her thumb traced it, slow, like the act itself was a prayer. Clara turned her head. Thomas lay beneath his coat, his face calm, eyes closed as if the night had simply taken his breath and left the rest untouched. The rifle rested by his side, a faint line of smoke still lingering near the barrel. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the horizon had started to glow a thin, pale band, trembling between silver and gold. Clara stood. Her body ached. Her hands were raw, but something inside her had gone strangely still. She looked down at him for a long while, this man who had entered their lives like a quiet storm, who had offered nothing but shelter and, somehow, given them everything. June's voice came out small. "He said we'd live without fear." Clara nodded. Her throat burned, but no tears came. "Then we will." They sat with him until the sun broke. It came fast, light spilling over the ridge, gold striking through the mist. The first warmth of it touched Thomas's face, softening every line. In that light, he looked less like a man who had fought, and more like one who had finally laid something down. Clara reached forward, adjusted his coat, smoothed it once, whispered something no one else would ever hear. The horses stood a little ways off, heads lowered, tails flicking lazily in the early light. The wind carried the smell of sage and rain-soaked dust. June rose, holding the hat close. She looked out toward the valley, endless and open, stretching far into the kind of quiet that only the West could hold. For the first time, that silence didn't scare her. "Come on," Clara said gently. "We should go." June looked back once more, her lips parting as if to say something. Then she placed the hat on a smooth rock by his side, resting it there like a promise. They walked slowly down the hill. The grass brushed their boots. The sun climbed higher, touching everything it could reach: the ridges, the dry stream, the wooden cross they'd built from an old fence post. Each step felt heavy and light all at once. At the foot of the hill, Clara turned back. From there, Thomas was only a shape against the sky, one small piece of the land that had made him. The wind stirred, lifting her hair, carrying with it the faintest trace of smoke and dust. She didn't cry. Not yet. The tears would come later, in some quiet hour when the world forgot to keep moving. But for now, she only stood still and breathed. June took her hand. "Where do we go now?" Clara looked toward the north where the light seemed softer, the horizon wider. "Wherever we want." June smiled faintly. It was the first time she'd done so without fear chasing it. They walked until the ridge disappeared behind them. The earth stretched open, vast and golden, the sky unfolding like an endless sheet. The road ahead wasn't marked, just a trail worn by hooves and wind and time. Clara led the way. Her boots left small prints in the dirt. June followed close, humming a tune their mother used to sing, a tune she thought she'd forgotten long ago. The sound was thin, but it carried far in the morning air. After a while, Clara joined in. Their voices blended, unsteady at first, then clear. It wasn't a song about grief. It wasn't even about hope. It was just a sound of being alive, of moving forward because there was nothing left to run from. Behind them, the wind rolled gently over the ridge. A hawk circled high, its shadow gliding over the place where the man had fallen. The sun warmed the land by inches, the light spreading slow across the plains. And somewhere in that warmth, in the quiet weight of that morning, there was peace fragile, honest, real. Clara stopped once more to look back. The horizon shimmered in the heat, already rising from the ground. The house they'd left behind was miles south now, invisible but not forgotten. She thought of the porch, the sound of boots on wood, the smell of coffee at dawn, small things, steady things. Her hand went to the small leather pouch at her belt inside, a single cartridge, polished and clean. She'd kept it not as a weapon, but as remembrance. She held it for a second, then tucked it away again. June caught her eye. You think he knew? Clara frowned softly. Knew what? That he changed everything? Clara's gaze drifted toward the horizon. The light was so bright now that it blurred the line between land and sky. Yeah, she said quietly. I think he did. They stood there for a long time, the wind moving around them, gentle as breath. The sun climbed higher. The shadows shrank. When they finally started walking again, they didn't look back. The world was wide, and for the first time, it belonged to them. The plains ahead shimmered gold and white under the growing heat. Somewhere, water would be running a creek, maybe winding between cottonwoods. Somewhere, there would be another place to rest, another dawn to wake to. Their silhouettes grew smaller against the land until they were only part of it, two figures folded into the vast quiet of morning. The light kept rising. The day opened slow and forgiving. And in the space between one breath and the next, the wind carried a sound, faint, fleeting like the echo of a man's voice saying softly, "You're home now. If stories like this find a quiet place in your heart, stay a little while longer and subscribe. There are more winds still whispering out west, out on those wide Wyoming plains, where the wind never stops and silence holds its own kind of truth. This story reminds us of something simple and sacred. Kindness is never small. It changes the shape of the world, one quiet act at a time. Thomas Grady didn't fight to be remembered. He fought so two lost souls could stand free. In doing so, he found peace for himself, the kind that doesn't come from victory, but from doing what's right when no one is watching. We live in a time where noise often drowns out compassion, where it's easy to turn away from another's pain. But this story whispers a different lesson: that mercy still matters, that dignity can be restored, and that even the most broken hearts can find their way back to warmth. For those of us who've seen life's storms come and go, perhaps this is what remains: the quiet, knowing that love, courage, and decency are never wasted. They echo long after the gunfire fades, like the wind that keeps singing over the hills. Thank you for riding with us through this story, for sitting a while beside the fire, and listening to the wind carry voices from a time long gone. If this tale touched something quiet in your heart, we'd be grateful if you'd leave a like, share it with someone who still believes in kindness, and subscribe to Wild West Echoes. Every story we tell is a small light in the dark, and with your support, that light keeps burning. Until the next ride, stay gentle and keep the West alive in your heart.